A thick, unsettling silence lingered in the grand hall of the Adeyemi mansion. The weight of Rhoda's revelation still hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on everyone like a humid storm waiting to break. But amidst the shock, one figure stood motionless, her hands clenched tightly at her sides, Moro. The fight had left her. For the first time in her life, she felt small. Defeated. Stripped of all the confidence, anger, and entitlement that had fueled her battle against Roda. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to look around the room. The disapproving gazes. The stunned expressions. Even Aikenwale, her once beloved prize, wasn't looking at her anymore. She had lost. But worse than losing, she had played the wrong game entirely. With a deep breath, Moro steadied herself. She had spent years building a reputation, clawing her way into elite circles, ensuring that her name commanded respect wherever it was mentioned. But at that moment, all she could think of was how terribly wrong she had been. Her eyes darted across the room and landed on Rhoda, the one person she had tormented without restraint. Slowly, she approached her. Rhoda, sensing her presence, stiffened but did not move. Moro exhaled. Rhoda, her voice trembled slightly. I don't even know where to begin. Rhoda remained still, her expression unreadable. I was wrong, Moro admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I have done terrible things to you. I have insulted you, mocked you, treated you like nothing. And yet, you stood your ground. Her lips quivered. I am ashamed of myself. A pause. Rhoda finally turned to look at her, her gaze piercing but not cruel. I'm sorry, Moro continued, shaking her head. From the bottom of my heart, I regret everything I did to you. Every word. Every action. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I was blinded by my own desires. I let my pride control me, and I took it all out on you. For the first time, Rhoda smiled. If I were in your shoes, she said softly, I would have probably done worse. Moro blinked. You would. Rhoda gave a small nod. You fought for what you wanted, even though you fought the wrong way. But I understand. And I forgive you. Tears gathered in Moro's eyes. Thank you, she whispered. She turned next to Aikenwale. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. I owe you an apology, she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Not just for what I did, but for not understanding you. For forcing myself into your life when I should have tried to know what you needed. I never thought about your peace, your happiness. I only thought about what I wanted. Aikenwale remained silent for a long moment before nodding slightly. I appreciate that, he finally said. Moro took a shaky breath, then turned to Aikenwale's parents. Chief Adeyemi and his wife looked at her expectantly. She swallowed. Daddy, Mummy. I know I have always been your choice for Aikenwale. Her voice cracked slightly. And I know how disappointed you must feel right now. Chief Adeyemi's brows furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. But Akin was right all along. Moro shook her head, her lips trembling. We didn't understand him. I didn't understand him. I fought so hard to be his wife without realizing that I was never meant to be. And now, I see it clearly. She sighed. He doesn't need a woman to compete with him. He needs a woman who will complement him. Aikenwale's mother lowered her gaze, touched by her words. Moro straightened, wiping the corner of her eyes. I hope you will all forgive me for everything. I promise that no matter what, I will remain a friend of this family. Always. With those words, she turned swiftly on her heels and hurried out of the mansion. The doors shut behind her, leaving behind a stunned silence. The grand sitting room of the Adeyemi mansion felt smaller than ever, as though the air itself had thickened, pressing down on its occupants. The weight of Moro's departure lingered, not as a relief, but as an echo, stretching, expanding, and filling every corner of the room with something more suffocating than anger. Guilt. Shame. Regret. No one spoke. No one moved. For the first time in years, no voice rose in opposition, no heated words clashed in argument. It was as though time had slowed, forcing everyone to sit still and confront the ghosts of their past words. The things they had said. The things they had thought. The things they had believed about Rhoda without knowing, without questioning, without ever seeking to understand. One by one, the moments replayed in their minds. Aikenwale's father remembered the disgust in his voice when he had first spoken about Rhoda. A lazy, good-for-nothing woman, what can a man possibly do with such a wife? Aikenwale's mother recalled her disdain, the quiet hostility in her heart every time she looked at the young woman she had already condemned in her mind. What kind of girl does nothing? What kind of woman has no ambition? The aunts and uncles in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their thoughts burdened by every snide remark, every careless whisper, every ill-spoken word against Rhoda. She must be a gold digger. She must be waiting for Aikenwale to take care of her forever. Even Aikenwale, who had fought for Rhoda more than anyone else, now felt the bitter aftertaste of his own doubts. The silent moments he had watched her and wondered, what if they were right? The room grew heavier. The silence stretched longer. Minutes passed, yet still, no one dared to speak. No one knew how to break the spell of their own shame. And then, a gentle, lazy stretch broke the stillness. Rhoda, in her usual unbothered manner, arched her back, yawned lightly, and stretched her arms with the ease of a woman who had no care in the world. Then, in a voice as casual as though she were in her own home, she said, "Mummy, show me the way to your bedroom. I want to sleep. And when food is done, please send Aikenwale to come and wake me up for dinner." Every head turned. Every eye widened. The sheer audacity of her words struck them like thunder, yet, at the same time, something about the moment felt so absurd, so unreal, that no one could find the breath to challenge her. For a second, the silence remained, this time, not out of guilt, but out of shock. Then, to everyone's disbelief, Aikenwale's mother let out a small, unexpected chuckle. It was soft at first, like the whisper of the wind, then it grew into something fuller, something warmer. Something that broke the tension in the room like a knife slicing through butter. She turned to Rhoda, her expression unreadable at first, then gentle. With quiet acceptance, she rose from her seat, extended her hand, and simply said, "Follow me, my dear. Your wish is my command." And just like that, the spell was broken. Please subscribe. As Rhoda followed her into the hallway, the tension that had once gripped the room loosened, unraveling thread by thread. The shame remained, but now, it came with something else. The possibility of redemption. The possibility of making things right. The night was not over yet. Dinner was ready. The rich aroma of slow-cooked meat, freshly pounded yam, and steaming vegetable soup filled the air, weaving its way through the grand Adeyemi mansion. The servants moved efficiently, setting the dining table with polished cutlery, delicate porcelain dishes, and crystal goblets filled with chilled fruit juice. The atmosphere was different now, quieter, more subdued. There was no arrogance at the table tonight. No resentment. Only the lingering weight of unspoken truths and the echoes of Moreo's departure. Aikenwale's mother, who had spent years dismissing Rhoda as unworthy, now made sure that the very girl she had once scorned sat beside her. "Aikenwale, go and summon your girl," she said softly, turning to her son. Aikenwale nodded, rising from his seat. As he walked towards the guest room, his heart felt lighter. Things were changing. Slowly, yes, but surely. When he entered the room, Rhoda was lying on the large bed, arms stretched lazily above her head, her eyes closed. "Dinner is ready," he said. She opened one eye slightly. Bring it here." Aikenwale chuckled. "No, madam. You're eating at the table like everyone else." Rhoda groaned, rolling to her side. "Akin, must I?" "Yes." She sighed dramatically, but the corners of her lips twitched in amusement. She had expected this. Slowly, lazily, she sat up, stretching again. "Fine," she said, "but only because I know you won't let me sleep in peace otherwise." When they entered the dining hall, all eyes turned to her. But this time, it was different. The stares were not filled with judgment. Not with mockery. Not with disdain. They were filled with remorse. Regret. Understanding. Aikenwale pulled out her chair, and she sank into it with her usual elegance. His mother, sitting beside her, placed a gentle hand on her wrist. Then, just as the prayers were about to be said, Aikenwale's father cleared his throat. "Before we eat," he said, his voice deep and steady, "there is something we must do." Everyone fell silent. He turned to Rhoda. "We owe you an apology." Aikenwell's father, he patriarch of the Adeyemi family, the man who had once opposed her so fiercely, was the first to bow his head in humility. "I judged you without knowing you," he admitted. "I spoke about you with ignorance and arrogance. I was wrong." He sighed, glancing at his wife, then back at Rhoda. "We were all wrong." Then, turning to the rest of the family, he declared, "One by one, I want each of you to apologize properly." And just like that, they did. No arguments. No resistance. One by one, every single person at that table turned to Rhoda and tendered heartfelt apologies. The aunt who had whispered behind her back. The uncle who had dismissed her as a gold digger. The cousins who had rolled their eyes at her laziness. The mother who had vowed never to accept her. They all spoke. And she listened. Not interrupting. Not rushing. She listened intently to each apology, her expression unreadable, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her goblet. For the first time, they were seeing her not as a lazy girl, but as a woman with depth, with wisdom, with a story they had never bothered to understand. And as each voice carried across the table, one thing became clear. They were not just apologizing to her. They were apologizing for every wrong assumption they had ever made about anyone they had failed. The meal was over. Plates were being cleared, glasses refilled, and soft conversations hummed across the table. But despite the return of a comfortable atmosphere, something still lingered in the air. Something unsaid. Then, Rhoda cleared her throat. The sound was soft but commanding. Immediately, all eyes turned to her. And as if they had rehearsed the moment 1,000 times, the entire family chorused together. "We are all ears." Rhoda swallowed. Her gaze swept over each face: Aikenwell's mother, who had once rejected her, his father, who had scorned her, the aunts and uncles, the cousins, and even Aikenwell himself. Then, to everyone's shock, she did something none of them expected. She slid off her chair and knelt down. A collective gasp filled the air. This was the same Rhoda who wouldn't lift a finger even when a glass of water was right in front of her. The same Rhoda who would rather sleep than argue. The same Rhoda who had allowed people to call her lazy without ever defending herself. And yet, here she was, on her knees. And then, the tears came. Fat, heavy drops rolled down her cheeks, soaking her face, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I am the one who should be apologizing to all of you," she began. Silence. "I am the one who fooled you all, who let you believe something that was never true. I came into this family pretending to be something I am not. And in doing so, I made all of you judge me wrongly." She sniffed, wiping at her tears with trembling hands. "If I had been myself, if I had let you all see me for who I truly am, maybe things would have been different. Maybe all these misunderstandings wouldn't have happened." Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to continue. "But I couldn't. I just couldn't." She bowed her head, as if in shame. "Because I've been here before." Aikenwell's mother gasped softly, but Rhoda did not lift her head. "I have watched men look at me and see nothing but a ticket to wealth. I have seen them love my beauty, my power, my charm, but never me. Never the woman inside this body. I have watched love become a transaction, where my worth is measured only by the size of my bank account. Where my heart is invisible beneath the weight of my wealth." A broken sob tore from her lips. "So I hid. I stripped myself of everything. I threw away the riches, the power, the titles, just to see if someone would love me for nothing." She raised her tear-streaked face, looking at Aikenwell's father, then his mother, then at Aikenwell himself. "Please subscribe." And that is how I found myself here. A deep silence settled in the room, thick and suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. For the first time, they weren't just listening to Rhoda. They were seeing her. The woman behind the disguise. The woman behind the laziness. The woman who had spent her whole life searching for a love that had nothing to do with money, power, or privilege. And they were speechless. Aikenwell's mother was the first to move. Without hesitation, she approached Rhoda, her face tender, her heart softened by the weight of the young woman's confession. Silently, gently, She took Rhoda's hands and helped her up from her knees. Rhoda let out a trembling breath, her eyes still wet with unshed tears. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, she said, "Thank you, Mummy." Aikenwell's mother nodded but said nothing. She only guided Rhoda back to her seat, as if handling something fragile. The moment Rhoda was settled, she exhaled deeply, wiped her face with the back of her palm, and turned to face the family again. This time, her eyes held a quiet strength. "Daddy, Mummy, brothers, and sisters," she began, her voice clearer now. "I have something else to confess to all of you. Aikenwell is my 6th relationship." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Rhoda continued, "I have succeeded in everything. I mean everything: business, education, wealth, power, but there's one thing I have never succeeded in." She paused, her throat tightening. "My love life." The silence deepened. "I have failed 5 times before now. 5 painful, humiliating failures. 5 times, I believed I had found the one, only to realize that I was nothing more than a financial institution to them. Not a woman. Not a partner. Just a wallet." She let out a small, bitter laugh. "Let me tell you about the first man who broke me." She closed her eyes briefly, as if summoning the ghosts of her past. "His name was Samson." Aikenwell's father shifted in his seat, while Aikenwell clenched his fists beneath the table. "Samson was my first love. Or so I thought. For 3 years, I poured my heart into that relationship, believing, hoping that it was real." She shook her head, smiling sadly. "But it was never love. It was an investment. Not for me, but for him." Her eyes darkened with old pain. "He was with me for my money. Nothing more. He took millions of dollars from me, promising me dreams we would build together. But do you know what he did with that money?" She looked up, her gaze sharp and piercing. "He spent it on his other girlfriends." Gasps filled the room. Aikenwell's mother clutched her chest. Rhoda smiled, but it was a smile full of bitterness. "And do you know the worst part? He was never grateful. Never once did he say thank you. Instead, he treated me like a fool." She exhaled sharply. "And for 3 years, I allowed it. Until one day, I woke up and realized that I was bleeding for someone who wouldn't even lift a finger for me." Her voice hardened. "That was the day I finally dumped him. Not because I stopped loving him, oh no. But because I finally accepted that he never loved me at all." A heavy silence settled over the family. They were no longer just listening. They were feeling every word. Rhoda swallowed hard, her lips trembling. "And that, my dear family, was just the beginning. After the heartbreak with Samson, I vowed to guard my heart more fiercely. But love, with its unpredictable nature, found me once again. At an annual general meeting of one of my many business ventures, a gathering where shareholders discuss the company's performance, approve financial statements, and make pivotal decisions, I met Emeka. Emeka was the epitome of charm. Wealthy, handsome, and exuding an air of confidence, he was the man every woman noticed. Women flocked around him, drawn to his charisma like moths to a flame. For me, Emeka seemed like a breath of fresh air. He understood the intricacies of business, shared my passion for growth, and, most importantly, made me feel seen beyond my wealth. But as our relationship progressed, cracks began to appear. Emeka's flirtatious nature was not just harmless banter, it was a pattern. Every event we attended, he was surrounded by admirers, basking in the attention. I tried to dismiss my growing unease, attributing it to my past experiences. But the whispers became louder, and the rumors harder to ignore. Summoning my courage, I confronted Emeka about his behavior. His response was a dagger to my heart. "You're being paranoid, Rhoda. Just because you're wealthy doesn't mean you own me. Stop being so proud." The accusation of pride stung, especially when all I sought was loyalty. Without another word, Emeka walked away, leaving me standing amidst the shattered pieces of yet another failed relationship. He never returned, and I was left to pick up the fragments of my heart, wondering if genuine love was ever in the cards for me. After Emeka walked away, I convinced myself that maybe my approach to love had been all wrong. If the rich and accomplished men were unfaithful, perhaps love existed in a simpler place, among men who had nothing to offer but their hearts. So, I made an audacious decision: I would date someone poor. Among all the workers in my household and business empire, I noticed Ibrahim, one of my personal drivers. He was quiet, respectful, and never tried to impress me. Unlike others who fawned over my wealth, Ibrahim seemed completely indifferent to it. I was intrigued. At first, he resisted my advances. "Madam, I be ordinary driver. Abeg, no use me joke." Those were his words. He was hesitant, almost frightened by the idea of being involved with me. But I was determined. I showered him with care, attention, and more money than he had ever seen in his life. Little by little, his resistance faded, and he agreed to marry me. It was the most expensive mistake of my life. I didn't just elevate him, I completely rebuilt him. I built him 2 houses, one for his extended family and a mansion for himself. I bought him a massive shopping complex, ensuring he had a steady source of wealth. I gifted him 4 SUV cars, transforming him overnight into a man of status. I paid for his rebranding, his clothes, mannerisms, and even his speech, training him to fit into high society. In my mind, I was molding him into the perfect partner, someone who would be loyal simply because I had made him who he was. My father was furious. "This is mad romance," he thundered. "It will never work. You cannot train a man like a dog and expect him to know only you." But I was blinded by my own belief. I thought if I built Ibrahim up with my own hands, he would never know another woman. He would worship the ground I walked on. I was wrong. 1 year into our relationship, one of my closest friends arrived at my house, her face pale with shock. "Rhoda, you need to sit down," she said. "Ibrahim has married 2 women. Both are pregnant." I don't remember what happened after that because I fainted on the spot. For weeks, I was hospitalized, slipping in and out of a fevered state, my body rejecting the betrayal like a poison. When I recovered, I made myself a promise. Never again. I had promised myself, never again. Never again would I allow myself to be used. Never again would I let love fool me. Never again would I trust a man with my heart. But barely a month after my recovery, that promise shattered like thin glass. One afternoon, a close friend of mine visited my home. She wasn't alone. With her was her elder brother, a man 10 years older than me. He was calm, observant, and had the kind of presence that made people listen when he spoke. His voice was deep, steady, carrying an air of wisdom that only life could bestow. "Rhoda, meet my elder brother," my friend said excitedly. "He's single and looking for a serious relationship. What do you think?" I didn't even blink. No. I was done with love. But my friend was relentless. She didn't take my refusal seriously. She pestered me, argued with me, and even guilt-tripped me. "Rhoda, not all men are like the ones you've met. You can't give up. Just try one more time." I said no. "Okay, fine, don't marry him. Just talk to him. Give him a chance." And just like that, I fell again, not because I wanted to, but because something in me still whispered that maybe it wasn't over yet. Maybe this time would be different. I agreed to date him, reluctantly. But unlike my past relationships, this one was different from the very beginning. From the first day we got together until the moment we broke up, this man never treated me like a lover. He treated me like a student. Like a misguided soul in desperate need of enlightenment. I later found out that before our first date, his younger sister had briefed him extensively about my past, about my wealth, my failed relationships, my struggles with love, and my upbringing. Armed with that knowledge, he took it upon himself to redeem me. "Rhoda," he said on our first real date, "I'm not just here to love you. I'm here to save you." "Save me?" I frowned. "From what?" "From yourself." From that day forward, our relationship turned into a classroom of hard life lessons. He lectured me at every opportunity, pointing out the reasons why, according to him, I could never sustain a stable relationship. "Your problem, Rhoda, is that you were raised wrong." "Excuse me?" "Yes. Your parents failed you. They raised you like a princess, not a woman. They gave you everything, but they never taught you how to be an actual human being who can live without privilege. Look at yourself." He paused, staring at me like I was some rare museum artifact. You don't know how to cook, do you? I swallowed. You can't wash your own clothes, nor iron them. You've never done house chores in your life. You are completely rotten, Rhoda. Money has ruined you. Surprisingly, I was not offended. Because everything he said was true. It was painful to hear, but I couldn't argue with it. I had never truly done anything for myself. From the moment I was born, life had been effortless. I had never washed my own clothes. I had never cooked a meal. I had never cleaned a single room. Every aspect of my life was handled by maids, chauffeurs, assistants, and staff. If I wanted a meal, I didn't go to the kitchen, I ordered it. If my dress got stained, I didn't wash it, I simply bought another one. I had been trained for only one thing, to read, to study, to prepare myself to take over my father's empire. But never once did my parents think to prepare me for love. For life beyond wealth. For a world where my name and status didn't matter. As much as this man's words stung, I knew he was the only person who had ever told me the truth without sugarcoating it. And for that, I stayed. I stayed, hoping to learn. Hoping to change. But change wasn't as easy as I thought. Rhoda wiped her tears and let out a small chuckle. Funny enough, this man never asked me for a dime. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. He was not poor, neither was he a millionaire. Just comfortable. More importantly, he never visited me at my place. Never. We only met at locations of his choosing, quiet, secluded spots where our lecture sessions could never be interrupted. Aikenwale's father raised a curious brow. Lecture sessions? Yes, Daddy. That's what they were, pure lectures on life, love, and everything in between. She shook her head, half amused, half exasperated, as the memories came flooding back. And do you know what was even more bizarre? I was not allowed to arrive in any of my so-called stupid toys. That's what he called my cars, stupid toys. At this, Aikenwale let out a laugh, but he quickly covered his mouth. Rhoda continued. I had to take public transport. Always. And trust me, that experience was inexplicable. Strange. Harrowing. But it changed me. It made me street smart in ways I never imagined. She sighed. Before then, I never knew my way around the city. I had never entered a commercial bus in my life. But that wasn't the worst part. More than once, I forgot to carry cash with me. I'd get on a bus, and when it was time to pay, I'd confidently tell the driver I would do a bank transfer. She paused dramatically, then spread her hands. Guess what? Most of the drivers didn't even have bank accounts. The room erupted into laughter. Rhoda grinned. They would look at me like I had just spoken an alien language. And when they refused to let me go, I had to beg them to follow me to the nearest bank or POS shop. And trust me, when I finally paid, I always paid them 4 times the fare. The laughter doubled. Even Aikenwale's father, who had been watching her sternly, couldn't hold back a chuckle. Please subscribe. Ah. Rhoda sighed, shaking her head. I became so popular that bus drivers started fighting over who would pick me up. Whenever I stood at a bus stop, it was chaos. They would shout, "Carry 'em. No, Amy go carry 'em today. Madam transfer don land." At this point, everyone in the room burst into uncontrollable laughter. Tears streamed down Aikenwale's mother's face as she held her stomach, shaking. Rhoda wiped her own tears, grinning. And that, my dear family, is how I became a celebrity among bus drivers. The laughter continued. Rhoda's smile faded slightly as she continued, her voice now softer, more reflective. But Samuel, for all his lectures on humility, never actually lived like a pauper. She shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. He had only 2 cars, nothing compared to my fleet, of course, but he always drove himself to our meetings. And after each one, he would drop me right in front of my house, never stepping in, never even slowing down enough to acknowledge the building. He would just speed off. Aikenwale's mother leaned forward. Why? Mummy, I asked him that question too. Once, I suggested he should at least meet my parents, since we were getting serious. But he dismissed the idea so strongly, I dared not bring it up again. "It is too early," he said. That was the only explanation he ever gave me. And she let out a small chuckle. I never pushed him again. Then, with deliberate slowness, she turned her gaze toward Aikenwale. "For your information, love." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. "Yours sincerely, I must always go to his house every Saturday to cook his food, do his laundry, sweep his floor, and follow him to the local markets to buy our weekly supplies." A pin-drop silence followed. We never bought anything from supermarkets or departmental stores. Never. He called the owners of such businesses oppressors. He said they thrived on the sweat of the poor while pretending to offer convenience to the rich. Aikenwale's father let out an amused grunt. "That one NA communist." Rhoda laughed softly. I never truly understood why he thought that way, but one thing was clear: I was being exposed to a different world. A world I had never known existed. She took a deep breath. "You may wonder why I never complained. Why I, Rhoda, the pampered, privileged daughter of a billionaire, would willingly scrub floors and bargain for tomatoes in a noisy market. But the truth is, Samuel was different." Her voice turned wistful. "He was responsible. He had a good sense of humor. He made me laugh effortlessly, and for the first time in my life, I was never afraid of being used, never afraid of his intentions. He made me feel safe. He was a realist, never taking anything for granted, and most importantly, he was honest. In fact, if there's one thing I truly learned from him, it was the virtue of honesty." She sighed, shaking her head. "But Samuel had his flaws, too. He was too serious about life, too stubborn, and at times, he was almost proud. But I didn't care. I was willing, more than willing, to follow him, to love him, to build a life with him, until..." She stopped abruptly. Aikenwale's mother leaned forward. "Until what?" Rhoda exhaled. A collective groan filled the room. Even Aikenwale rolled his eyes, shaking his head with a grin. "Rhoda, you no go kill person." But Rhoda only smiled. The room had fallen into a trance, every eye locked onto Rhoda as she poured out her heart. No one dared interrupt. Even Aikenwale, who had been listening with quiet amusement, now sat up, fully engaged. Rhoda inhaled deeply, as if drawing strength from the air. "Until one day," she began, her voice taking on a softer, heavier tone. "I received a call from Samuel, asking me to meet him at one of our usual spots. There was something in his voice, something unsettling. It wasn't the usual confidence, the firm, almost patronizing tone he used when giving me one of his life lectures. It was off. So, I went." She exhaled, shaking her head. "When I arrived, he was already waiting, standing by the entrance, his hands buried in his pockets. But it was his face that struck me first. Samuel, the man who never showed weakness, looked broken." Aikenwale's mother let out a small gasp, leaning in. "The moment he opened his mouth, I knew. I just knew." Rhoda swallowed hard. "He sorrowfully announced that he wouldn't be able to continue with our relationship. I remember staring at him, my heart still, waiting, hoping it was some kind of twisted joke. But then, he said something that shattered everything. My former lady has decided to come back to me, and I cannot say no." A deafening silence filled the room. Rhoda let out a small chuckle, but there was no humor in it. Samuel, the great teacher, the man who stripped me of my pride and taught me humility, was now the one breaking me. And yet, he was crying. She shook her head, lost in the memory. He cried like a baby, hot tears streaming down his face, his body trembling. He kept apologizing, kept saying he never meant to fall in love with me, that he never intended for things to go this far. And do you know the saddest part? I cried with him. I sat there, weeping like a fool, because somehow, in ways I hadn't even realized, I had fallen for him too. Aikenwale clenched his jaw, but he said nothing. But even as I cried, I knew. I knew we had no future. Samuel, my friend, my teacher, the man who reshaped me, was never meant to be my husband. And so, I left him there, broken but not destroyed, sad but not devastated, because unlike my former lovers, Samuel had never deceived me. He never took anything from me but gave me something greater: wisdom. She paused, glancing around the room. It didn't take me long to heal. In fact, I was getting used to being dropped. A sad, knowing smile spread across her lips. But a few months later, Samuel personally brought me an invitation letter to his wedding. Gasps rippled through the family. I looked at him and smiled, told him I wouldn't attend. He insisted, pleaded, but I refused. I had no space in my heart to watch him say I do to another woman. She let out a deep sigh. But I wasn't bitter. No. Instead, I told him I wanted to appreciate him with a token. The room went still. At first, he refused. Samuel had never taken money from me, not even for fuel. But when I insisted, he finally agreed. I transferred 100 million naira into his account. A collective gasp. He was stunned. He thanked me over and over, and we parted on good terms. Today, he, his wife, and their son live in the United States. We haven't spoken in years, but I still have his number. She paused, looking around as if searching for something. Then, her gaze settled on Aikenwale. Will you ever believe, love, that it was Samuel who engineered the idea of me stripping myself of wealth and status? That it was his idea for me to lie low in order to find true love? Aikenwale's lips parted, but no words came out. His mother covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. The silence was thick, heavy, pressing down on everyone. Then, out of nowhere, Aikenwale's father let out a low whistle. 100 million naira, he muttered. For a breakup. Laughter exploded in the room. Rhoda joined in, shaking her head. But beneath her laughter, there was something else, something only Aikenwale noticed. Pain. But the story wasn't over yet. The night air was thick with tension, but Rhoda was too lost in her own memories to notice. She leaned back slightly, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her wine glass. Exactly 2 months after Samuel's wedding, I met a charming young boy, she continued, her voice rich with nostalgia. The room remained silent, the weight of her previous story still lingering. Even Aikenwale, who had been skeptical at first, was now fully engaged. He was 2 years younger than me, she said, a small smile playing at her lips. He came for a recording audition in one of my studios. Maybe you've heard the name before. She paused, inhaling deeply before uttering the words that would change the course of the night. Roda Studios plc. The effect was instantaneous. Gasps filled the room, an audible wave of disbelief sweeping over Aikenwale's family. His mother clutched her chest, her eyes wide in shock. His father sat upright, blinking rapidly as if trying to process what he had just heard. But the most dramatic reaction came from Folake, Aikenwale's younger sister. Rogel? Rogel what? No. Folake's scream cut through the air as she lunged toward her mother, grabbing onto her like a drowning person clinging to a life raft. I can't believe this. It's not possible. It's a lie. No. Her wail echoed through the room, her body trembling with uncontrollable excitement. The sheer force of her reaction left Rhoda completely alarmed. She turned to Aikenwale, her brows furrowed in confusion. What is going on? Why is she acting like this? She asked, looking from one bewildered face to another. Aikenwale let out a slow breath before turning to face her, his expression unreadable. Rhoda, you have no idea what you've just done, he said. She frowned. I don't understand. He gestured toward Folake, who was still gripping their mother's hand as if her life depended on it. My sister, Aikenwale explained, has been unsuccessfully pursuing a label contract with Roda Studios for over 2 years. Rhoda's eyes widened. What? Yes, he confirmed. For over 2 years, she has poured her heart and soul into trying to get signed. And yet, sitting before her this entire time, completely oblivious, is the very founder and CEO of the company of her dreams. Silence fell over the room, every gaze locked onto Rhoda. Then, suddenly, Folake broke free from her mother's grip and stumbled forward, her breath ragged, her chest heaving. With tears glistening in her eyes, she fell to her knees before Rhoda, her head bowed. Please forgive me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Rhoda blinked, stunned. Forgive you? For what? Folake looked up, shame written all over her face. I have insulted you, she admitted. disdained you eloquently in the past, mocked your name without ever knowing who you were. I have spoken ill of you without reason. And yet, here you are, the very person I have been desperately chasing for years. Please, I beg you, forgive me. Rhoda's lips parted in shock. She had never met this girl in her entire life. And yet, here she was, kneeling at her feet, begging for a pardon she didn't even know she needed to give. She reached forward and gently pulled Folake up. Stand, my dear, she said softly. You have already apologized, and I have already forgiven you. Folake sniffled, wiping her tears. Rhoda studied her for a moment before tilting her head slightly. But, if you've been trying to get signed for 2 years, why haven't you gotten through? Rogel is very open to new talent. Folake hesitated, then looked away. It's because of Mr. Talou, she mumbled. Rhoda frowned. Who? One of your top talent scouts, Aikenwell supplied. He has been stalling her, demanding undue advantage before signing her in. Rhoda's eyes darkened. What? Folake nodded. Every time I submitted my demos, he would listen and praise my voice, but when I followed up, he would start making demands, personal favors, things I could not do. When I refused, he would suddenly claim my songs were not good enough, that I needed more time to develop. But I knew it was a lie. Rhoda inhaled sharply, rage bubbling beneath the surface. Without hesitation, she turned to Folake. Go and bring your contract documents. Folake's breath hitched. What? I said go and bring your contract documents, Rhoda repeated firmly. For a split second, Folake remained frozen. Then, as if suddenly jolted back to life, she spun around and sprinted inside. A tense silence filled the air as everyone waited. Minutes later, Folake came running back, a bundle of papers clutched tightly in her hands. She stopped in front of Rhoda, panting heavily, and held them out. Without hesitation, Rhoda took the documents, flipped through them quickly, and then, right there, in the presence of Aikenwell's entire family, she signed her name. The room erupted. Folake let out a high-pitched scream of joy, clutching the signed contract to her chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. Aikenwell's mother gasped, holding her hands over her mouth. Aikenwell's father simply leaned back in his chair, blinking in utter disbelief. My daughter is signed to Rogel Studios, he murmured, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. Folake, meanwhile, had fallen to the floor, singing praises at the top of her lungs. The atmosphere was electric. But then, suddenly, to the relief of everyone, Aikenwell's father sat forward, raising his hand. All right, that's enough, he announced, his voice cutting through the chaos. Before we all drop dead from excitement, I am officially ending this meeting for the night. A collective groan followed. Yes, retreat to bed immediately, he ordered. We shall continue this season film tomorrow at the same time. Laughter rang out across the room. One by one, everyone began to rise, their emotions still high from the unexpected revelation. But as they moved toward their respective rooms, Folake's voice carried above them all, still singing songs of praise. Rhoda smiled to herself. The night had taken an unexpected turn. And somehow, she had the feeling that tomorrow's meeting would be even more dramatic. Morning broke gently over the Aikenwell household, its golden light filtering through the heavy curtains of the grand estate. Unlike other mornings, where the first stirrings of life came from the household staff, today it was Rhoda who woke first. After saying her morning prayers and reading her Bible, she stretched lightly and let out a deep breath. She had slept well, despite the drama of the previous night. Please subscribe. Feeling refreshed, she decided to head into the kitchen. It was not her first instinct to sit idly while others worked, and besides, she wanted to get a feel for the household dynamics. She had always believed that true leadership meant understanding every level of an establishment, even the seemingly insignificant roles. As she stepped into the kitchen, she met the housemaids and kitchen assistants, all busily preparing breakfast. They glanced up in surprise when they saw her enter. Good morning, everyone, she greeted warmly. The women exchanged looks before one of them, an older woman with a motherly presence, cautiously stepped forward. Good morning, Ma, she replied hesitantly. What are we making? Rhoda asked, rolling up her sleeves. The maids froze. "Ah, no, Ma. You cannot join us," one of the younger maids blurted out, her eyes wide in horror. Rhoda raised an eyebrow. "And why not?" "Madam will not allow it. If she sees you working with us, she will be very angry," the older woman explained. Rhoda chuckled. "Let her be angry. I will bear the blame." She reached for a knife and began dicing vegetables, ignoring their protests. "Madam will punish us," another maid whispered in distress. Rhoda smiled, her hands expertly chopping onions. "I promise you, she won't punish anyone. If she must punish someone, let it be me." Seeing her determination, the women hesitated for a moment but eventually gave in, allowing her to assist. Together, they worked in harmony, preparing a lavish breakfast. Laughter and light chatter filled the kitchen as Rhoda seamlessly blended in, working just as diligently as the rest. They had just begun setting the dining table when a sudden, sharp gasp cut through the air. "What is going on here?" A stunned silence fell over the room as everyone turned to see Aikenwell's mother standing at the doorway, her face a mixture of disbelief and outrage. The noise was so loud that it echoed through the mansion, waking everyone up. Within minutes, footsteps thundered down the stairs as members of the household rushed to see what had caused such a commotion. Aikenwell's mother stood frozen in shock, her eyes locked onto Rhoda, who was standing by the dining table, dressed in a simple kitchen apron, looking like one of the maids. The sight was unthinkable. Gasps filled the room. Aikenwell's siblings stared in wide-eyed astonishment. Even the maids looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Adewale, Aikenwell's elder brother, was the first to find his voice. He shook his head in disbelief and opened his mouth to speak, likely to support their mother's outrage, but before he could get a word out, their father's deep, commanding voice cut through the air. "Let the lady alone." Adewale's mouth snapped shut. Everyone turned toward the head of the household, who was now standing at the foot of the stairs, his sharp gaze moving from his wife to his children. "Do you want to start another round of foolish talks?" he asked, his voice heavy with warning. "Talks that you will later regret and begin to apologize for again?" A deep silence settled over the room. No one dared to argue. With a slow, authoritative movement, Aikenwell's father walked toward the table and pulled out a chair. He sat down, adjusting his agbada with regal ease. "Everyone get busy," he commanded. "We have an appointment with Rhoda's mother this morning after breakfast." His words seemed to shake the room back into motion. The maids quickly resumed their work, while the family members hesitated, digesting his statement. Aikenwell's mother frowned deeply and turned to him. "Who is Rhoda's mother?" she asked. Rhoda, who had been watching the entire exchange with amusement, glanced up with a playful glint in her eyes. She smiled and replied lightly, "The mother of the laziest lady in town." A stunned silence followed her words. And just like that, the day was set for another round of drama. Please subscribe.